So welcome to another panel for the Galaxy's Greatest 2000 AD at 45, where we are celebrating 2000 AD board games, RPGs, the influence of 2000 AD on gaming over the last 45 years. And I'm joined by three excellent panelists who each have their own knowledge and experience of adapting 2000 AD properties to games. So we'll start off by introducing Andy Chambers, who's, you've written more than 30 Games Workshop rule books over the years, and you work with Warlord Games now. So I'm
a terrifying power in tabletop gaming, apparently. So I've discovered. People tell me, on average, I do like one game every couple of years.
Wow!
And in between supplements and la 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 la. I don't know where it all comes from, honestly, but I have this massive back catalogue at this point. So people go like, "Oh, Andy knows about games." I'm like, "No, I don't. Not really. I just make them up."
Wonderful. We're also joined by Duncan Molloy, who's the head of Rebellion Unplugged, which is the owner of 2000 AD Rebellion's board games division. Good morning.
Good morning. How's it going? Beyond summing it up at that, I have a history even pre-Rebellion of working on Judge Dredd related tabletop games. I'm looking forward to chatting through it.
Brilliant. And last but by no means least, we have the legendary Ian Livingstone, who not only a founder of Games Workshop, but created the Judge Dredd board game in the early 80s, wrote the fighting fantasy books. It's wonderful to have you on the chat, Ian. Welcome.
It's great to be here, talking about the good old days.
That's right, when everything was made of wood. That's one of Rick Priestley's joke, which tells you how old that one is.
It's not just 45 years of 2000 AD and Judge Dredd, but Games Workshop itself going 47 years. This year is the 40th anniversary, not just of the Fighting Fantasy books. Thank you very much indeed for those, by the way. I never actually played them. I just read them as a kid. But 40 years since the release of the Judge Dredd board game. Now, for geeks of a certain age, the memory of this board game will be seared into their psyches. It was a perennial favorite amongst many of my friends when I was growing up. Ian, tell us a little bit about how that board game came to be, because Games Workshop and 2000 AD kind of come out of that amazing period of the 1970s when it feels like almost that was when geek culture was founded, you know?
Yeah, so I was a Judge Dredd fan from the get-go. I bought 2000 AD from issue 1 and became a big fan. And there was a time when we were looking to expand our range of board games, and I was pretty obsessive about Judge Dredd and thought it could make a really good board game. And we had good associations back with Titan Books and Forbidden Planet, and all that kind of science fiction scene was pretty big in those days. And I thought it'd be a good idea to have a Judge Dredd board game, and I came up with quite a nice little mechanic, I thought, to try and widen the hobby. I mean, it's not a heavy game at all. It's a very light game, but it's quite amusing. You have to go.
Dude, I have to say, for its time, in particular, even for now, the Judge Dredd board game is genius. I love that game so much. I had the same experience. Like, me and my friends used to play it all the time. And that mechanic, Judge Death, umpty bagging, and all the rest of it, the card play between it is something that we've tried to replicate when we did the tabletop game, because it left such a seared memory in our brains. Synthy Flakes, oh my God. It really does. To this day, I've not played that game in over 30 years, I don't think, but I still remember the cards from it.
The cards were great. I mean, the production value was also great. That was down to Albie Fury, sadly no longer with us, but he was great at visualization and trying to capture the essence of whatever IP we were trying to put into a board game. So I did the design of the game, the mechanic, the fact that you could find Judge Death littering, and that made it great. A lot of people laugh. But then he worked. I mean, we ended up scanning just every comic available to get the artwork. So he could create, I don't know if you remember Jack Caldwell's old-fashioned card album.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I can't remember how many cards were in it, but it's like a collector's, like when you collect football cards, it's like
This sort of Panini style sticker albums and stuff like that. It had such a strong resonance for a game.
Yeah,
for that time in particular, because you look at other board games, and it's SPI, Chit and Hex games, and all very serious business. And so,
I've been brought up on Avalon Hill and SPI, but I thought there was more to life than grinding your way across a hex board, and you wanted a lot more fun. And I like social interaction and that sort of camaraderie and fun of like-minded people sitting around a table, just trying to stab each other in the back and having a great time at the same time. So it seemed to play into that. And
I have to say, having played it a bit more recently, like it does a great job, and it does a particularly amazing job for its time of not just the kind of flavor of the like kind of character interactions and the art on the cards and stuff, but the flavor of the tone of the comic, if you know what I mean. Like the real feeling of, particularly in that kind of early 80s era of the comic where the grit of it rubs up alongside the absolute ridiculousness of it.
Yeah, and twists and turns as well of like, you think you've got it all under control, but boingers, here we come, boing on the head, or no, it's Edwin Parsi, and so it really was a slice of life for the Big Mag. It was fantastic stuff.
Yeah, it was. Even though it was a light game, it was some nice little moments that would kind of defeat you or enhance you or help you catch up or make you lose. So it was a big talking point, and we were delighted also to be able to get Brian Bolland to do the cover and Ian Gibson to do the board. I mean, that was quite a coup at the time to get them to do that. And I still have the cover on my wall at home.
Fantastic. I am so jealous. So are we to imply that there's going to be a remake of this coming out? Or is it already out? Am I completely ignorant and there is a Judge Dredd board game out there reprinted from this marvel from the 70s? Tell us, Duncan, tell us.
Well, there are several Judge Dredd board games out there, but the Judge Dredd board game in the year of its 40th anniversary, we are putting together a new edition of it, working with Ian. So that's I suppose this is the informal announcement ahead of formal announcement later in the year. But yeah, you
heard it here first, folks. Yeah,
brilliant. Awesome. I'm looking to do something with it similar to what we did when I re-released Escape from Colditz back a few years ago, back in past life, where the kind of I want to make it like just a tiny handful of updates to it, but stuff that makes it play like we remember it playing, if you know what I mean. So just like keep exactly that spirit of the kind of irreverence of it and the back and forth between the players, but hopefully try and slightly shorten the playtime, to be completely frank, and just keep the level of excitement that it kind of generates. So I'm really, really looking forward to it.
You did Blockmania as well.
Coldwell's old-fashioned Umpty Candy album in it.
Yeah.
Yes, we are absolutely keeping the Umpty Candy album. Have no fear. We did, we re-released Blockmania a few years ago as a Strive reprint, whereas this will be similar, but we'll have a little more meat in the bone, so to speak, on this one. So for this particular one of the things we're working on internally and kind of consulting with Ian on is some small expansions content and creating new content for it that's still in the spirit of the original game. So that kind of buying the box, you will have the experience exactly as played before, but you can
what about the
kind of modules you can play around with as well.
Maybe this is not the right forum to discuss it. I have to ask anyway. I mean, clearly the characters we had in the board game 40 years ago do not appear in today's comics. So you're not going to see Gestapo Bob Harris or Mark Green Fingers McAfee. I mean, are you going to have to still keep those in the album, or in a card, so you replace them with modern day adversaries?
I reserve the right to change my mind on this, but I think part of what's beautiful about it is the sense in which it's a time capsule, not just of an era of games, but of an era of Dredd, particularly as well. Yeah. That particular tone comes and goes, but I think I certainly wouldn't want to replace any of it, whether or not we supplement it with more of the new stuff we may do.
Because obviously the fans of old will want to see, Fink Angel and Ratty and all these other people.
Long dead crims, basically.
Yeah.
But today's audience will say, who are they? So it wouldn't have the same resonance. So I'm just wondering.
I don't know. I think like the image of Gestapo Bob Harris kind of being arrested for jaywalking has a resonance all of its own that you don't need to necessarily pick up on the fact that it's a reference to really get into it. But we will be looking at a few select highlights from down the years and ways we can maybe kind of hold it in, particularly looking at some of the more modern judges and having actual recognizable judge characters as some of the playable characters, that kind of thing.
Ian, I want to ask about the original game and its kind of wider impact, not just beyond 2000 AD fans, but on kind of Games Workshop and the evolution of the kind of games that you were producing. Was it a game that had a lasting impact, that you looked at what you'd created and like, oh, actually, this changes the kind of games that we're producing? Has it had a legacy in games beyond just fond memories?
I honestly can't remember how long we kept it in production, but it was at a period in Workshop where we were desperately trying to find a big IP that could scale ultimately globally. Because when we started Workshop, we ordered 6 copies of D&D from Gary Gygax, and on the back of that order, we got a 3-year exclusive distribution agreement for the whole of Europe. And because he was working out a flat, we were working out a flat, and we were kind of making up as we went along. At the end of that 3-year period, Gygax came over and said he wanted to merge TSR with Games Workshop. And Steve and I, being kind of independent, strong-minded young Brits at the time, said no to the merger opportunity because we didn't want to spend half our time in 100 miles west of Chicago and half the time in the UK. So we said no. So of course, then we lost the exclusivity of D&D, although we remained the largest distributor because we had all the customers. And we knew ultimately that we had to find something to replace that. So we started publishing our own range of board games. First 4 were Apocalypse, Doctor Who, Warlock, and Valley of the Four Winds. And then we added to the range over time. But ultimately, at the same time, we were still looking for that big thing in the kind of role-playing or fantasy area that's going to use a lot of miniatures, because half of Workshop was Citadel miniatures, and that's really what gave rise to Warhammer. Rick Priestley and Brian Ansell and Richard Halliwell set about creating the first Warhammer, which came out in '83, and obviously that iterated, become role-playing, ultimately 40k, and everything else kind of took second place as Warhammer grew to build the big intellectual property that the company needed to expand. And as you see where it is today. Yeah.
I have a question about that, if you don't mind, Ian. Did a word like intellectual property actually exist back then?
No idea.
Because I didn't hear it until like the late 90s, I think, after I'd been working at Games Workshop at that point for at least 8 to 9 years.
I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty certain it did, yeah. IP has always been a big thing. We used to probably talk about copyright more perhaps than trademarks than IP.
Yeah, I'm not saying that there wasn't a concept of that, of, something belonging to someone else. You
can't just have fun own, with it. Because that's, you determine your own destiny. With D&D, you realize that you're just not parcel forwarders, but you really rely on somebody else for your very existence. And we wanted something where we could determine our own existence and build a company on the back of that. So the whole value of Workshop is underpinned by the intellectual property in Warhammer, not just direct sales from retailing miniatures and rule books, but the licensing revenue, the incremental revenue from merchandise and licensing. I don't know how many video game licenses there are out now on 40k. It must be over 50. And merchandising rights, and ultimately the film rights, etc. So earning that IP value is absolutely vital if you want to scale a big business. Same with Judge Dredd. That's Rebellion owns a very important IP in Judge Dredd and 2000 AD in general.
Can I ask regarding the formation of Games Workshop's kind of worlds generally, right? And then kind of Warhammer specifically, right? The sense I have, and I'm Irish, Southern Irish, so I'm both like very, very adjacent to, British culture of a certain era, but also kind of half a step removed. The sense I have of kind of British fantasy and sci-fi culture has kind of two strands, so to speak. You have your kind of like respectable Lord of the Rings strand of kind of like classic high fantasy, and to what extent Doctor Who and kind of BBC style stuff on the one stream. And then on the other stream, you have your Warhammer and 2000 AD influence things, maybe Bundlehammer Horror in there as well. To what extent were you guys just living out that kind of sense of, did you have a sense of being counterculture? Or was it just you guys making the things you were into making?
We didn't have any sense of counterculture. We wanted to make games that we wanted to play ourselves, basically. But we didn't go just orcs and goblins. We wanted, we were influenced by another British influence. Was the time was Michael Moorcock and Elric and the comics we used to read. And we wanted it to be grim and dark and threatening, sort of medieval. I've always liked medieval worlds. I mean, one of my most popular Final Fantasy game books was City of Thieves, because the poor Black Sand is this just disgusting place littered with, danger at every corner and robbers and thieves and pirates and vagabonds. And it's that sense of dread and foreboding. And that's the kind of worlds we wanted to create. That really stimulates kids' minds. They don't need this sort of nice fantasy, because they can compartmentalize fantasy danger and the real world, and they're not really scared by it. They're actually thrilled and excited by it. So that was where we wanted to go with our art direction and our games direction to make games really exciting.
It's something you can notice about D&D, isn't it? Particularly in the early years, it tends to be a very kind of high fantasy picture of like medieval Europe. It's all castles and princesses and knights and so on. And the kind of contrast you get to that coming through, particularly in early Games Workshop, of like, no, we know Europe, we're right next to it. It's got this long and quite bloody history. A lot of the time it is very dark. 30 years war, 7 years war, 100 years war, and so forth, as more of a backdrop rather than this somewhat sanitized Disney-like version of fantasy that you tend to get in the New World. So, yeah, I think certainly when I was at Workshop from 1990 through to 2004, there was a strong sense of counterculture to that, because American media at that point was so overwhelming that it was in the vein of 2000 AD. It was far more sort of like punk attitude of no, we'll show how it really is and all this sort of stuff.
Just looking back to things like the Judge Dredd game, of course, there was a Rogue Trooper game as well that came out in 87, I think it was.
Rogue Trooper and Block Mania, and of course the Judge Dredd role-playing game. That was done by Mark Gascoigne and Rick Priestley.
It seems very much like 2000 AD is exactly the thing that you're you just describing, that kind of a little bit threatening, but also a lot of fun, very imaginative. Were there plans to continue doing 2000 AD games, or once Warhammer started up, was that it, and that became your primary focus?
Definitely became a primary focus, but I think we were of the belief at the time that Judge Dredd was definitely the strongest IP in the 2000 AD catalogue. I mean, we talked about Strontium Dog, I think, and maybe a couple of others, but we didn't think it'd have the impact or the kind of total addressable market, when I go a bit corporate, that Judge Dredd would have. And as soon as Warhammer started to kick in, everything was in support of that. And as you know, then White Dwarf became pretty much a Warhammer magazine, and all the miniatures were therefore focused on that. And after all, Workshop's about selling miniatures. And whilst we did make a few Judge Dredd miniatures, there was never going to be enough to justify, a Citadel Miniatures factory. So if you want to produce miniatures at scale, they have to be around a game that required lots of miniatures, and that was Warhammer.
One thing I'm very keen to touch on is just how you adapt. We've talked about just some of the games, and for people who aren't necessarily part of kind of the games ecosphere, it can seem kind of quite daunting just how many types of games and titles there are. But I'm very keen to get into the heart of how one adapts something like 2008. You've already spoken, Ian, of translating that kind of black humor, a little bit kind of threatening violence and things like that from 2000 AD. But what are the mechanics of that? Particularly when you're dealing with different kind of games. So not just board games, but RPGs, miniatures games, things like that. And this is a question for you all, really. What's the key to a good adaptation of something like 2000 AD?
Well, you got to capture the soul. I was a big Judge Dredd fan, and you have to distill the essence into some sort of game mechanic, so you feel that you're actually living in Mega City 1. And whilst it's fun and lighthearted and everyone have a good time, you've got to feel that it's actually the world from the comic is being portrayed. So many games in particular have taken IPs, and it's just become a marketing tool. It has the game itself hasn't got much to do with the title on the box. So we wanted to make sure, well, I did, because I was a fan, really capture the essence of Mega City 1 and all who sailed in it.
Yeah, it's okay. Some very fancy words here. A friend of mine likes the word verisimilitude, which is kind of truthiness, which is feeling true to the background you're drawing from. And really, as a games designer, just like any other creative, you're trying to do that. You're trying to distill truth. What is the truth about Mega City 1 and what it's like to be a judge there? What kind of, allies do you find along the way? What kind of threats do you face? And those are the things you kind of draw into the game that you're making, which is all just expanding on exactly what Ian just said, which is, yes, you if you've got any heart on soul at all, and you like the intellectual property, the story that you're working with, then you do everything in your power to make sure that you convey that to the players so they feel a little slice of that while they're playing the game. What mechanics you use can help to lead that, but it's not all about that. It's about content as well, and detail and emphasis within the game itself. What are you doing? What are you spending your time making decisions about?
At the same time, I didn't want to make it kind of turgid simulation.
This is exactly what I'm saying. It's because the Judge Dredd board game is a fantastic example of that, because you're not counting how many lawgiver rounds you've got left or anything like that. You're responding to crimes on the streets of Mega City 1, and you don't know what it's going to be until you get there. And that was kind of the genius of it. Is like you had no clue. You just knew there was a crime reported, but it could be Judge Death, it could be Gestapo Bob Harris, or any one of a number of other criminals there, or just some.
I mean, that's what I've always tried to do in games production. I mean, I did in Final Fantasy Gamebooks as well. It was to capture the essence of a role-playing game. Obviously, I played D&D for 7 years before I wrote the first Final Fantasy Gamebook, Wall of Firetop Mountain. But that was, some people said, "Oh, it's too light," but it really still gave you the feeling that you were in a fantasy world. And even though the combat system was just 3 attributes: skill, stamina, and luck, there's still a kind of feeling that you were gaming, and that the numbers gave you an idea, a visual idea of how strong the opponents you were meeting. And then the branching narrative was empowering for kids at the time, because they gave them the agency to explore these worlds. So you replace the dungeon master with a book and give them effectively multiple choice, but they talk about their adventures in the I form rather than they form, which is great. And it's trying to capture the essence without overcomplicating is what I've always tried to do.
Yeah, I think, like, for my own part, I think it's exactly that essence. And for me, it's almost the detail of the world, right, is almost secondary in terms of the way in which I try to approach adapting something like any of the 2080 properties, right, because they're all of a particular type in a particular tone and a particular level of detail and texture. And I think the thing that I try to do whenever I'm adapting something to a board game is in looking at the original thing, what experience is that giving the person who's reading it or playing it or experiencing it or whatever? Like what are the kind of feelings that the people who made the original are trying to generate in the person who's experiencing it, and what are the feelings that the people who respond to it really well and who kind of love it so much and make it part of their own identity are responding to, and trying to find a way to replicate that feeling first, or that emotion, or that response, and then going, okay, well, once we have that mechanic or whatever that method is, then going, well, it's in this world, so we found the kind of on-ramp, so to speak, and then using then all of the detail and texture that already exists in something like Mega City 1 or whatever to branch that out in different directions, which I realize sounds horrendously abstract, but it's the
hey, we're highfalutin games designers. What do you want from us? This is the way we think about things on that meta level. But yeah, it's about evoking the feeling more than the detail, because this is the thing with a comic-based title like Judge Dredd. You've got all this fantastic art behind it. You've got all these fantastic stories behind it. That bit's sorted, really. And it'd be very easy to make a game that just sort of goes through the numbers and so on. And then you've got loads of great illustration, you've got loads of Brian Bolland art or what have you to go through all the rest of it. And it'll look like a Judge Dredd game. But will it actually play like one? Or will it just play like another miscellaneous board or card or game or miniatures game? It's trying to get into the fabric of it a little bit more. In the miniatures game, the tabletop miniatures game that we did for it, cards has a big play, as I say, inspired by the Judge Dredd board game. Because one of the things that we had to confront, tabletop miniatures games are very they're very wargamery. I have this gun, you have that amount of armor and so forth. And if it's Tiger tanks and Shermans, that's one thing, because you can go to historical numbers and go like, oh, this is how it should work out. And you can extrapolate that into doing science fiction as well. It's not too hard. When it comes to trying to portray a comic book, however, it's not that easy either. Because lo and behold, the lawgiver is like a living example of a variable gun that can do anything from maybe put down a perp with a shot through the leg to blowing up a spaceship. And how do you actually cover that in a game, in a sort of a fairly kind of like numbers crunchy sort of like tabletop game? And cards was the answer to that. It's Synthy Flakes in a different fashion. Do you have a high X round for your lawgiver? Oh, no, you don't, because you don't have the card for it. How did you get the cards? You were dealt them randomly at the start of the scenario. Well, there you go. It starts to give that sort of like comic book unevenness to it, where it's not just like, it's not predictable what weapons or tactics you'll be able to use on the day. It depends on what the writer's got in mind for you for this particular comic strip, which for a tabletop war game, they're based on being sort of like fairly fair to start with. And it's not fair, but it's been delightful. We did this with Strontium Dog as well. We get time bombs and stuff like that. And because it's in the context of a comic book based game, a tabletop gamers are quite happy to accept that, because that's what happens in the comics, At the last moment, Johnny Alpha pulls out his time bomb and sends the bad guy off to another dimension or something like that. Not something you can usually get away with tabletop games, but it really works for 2000 AD based titles, I can tell you.
I think one of the things that sets 2000 AD apart as well from other, fantasy or sci-fi is the fact that it's not necessarily about heroism, right? Even the most quote unquote heroic of the 2000 AD protagonists, like Slane, for example, is more into, occasionally hard drinking, just doing what he's personally interested in rather than, necessarily following the hero's journey or whatever else. So in adapting it for a game, I think it's about not making it into a power trip necessarily, which a lot of games, a lot of D&D often can become as well. It's very much about how can I feel like the most powerful version of myself and the most heroic version of myself and the most noble version of myself, but instead going how can I react to complex problems in a way that is gritty but also just tremendously fun, you know?
Yes, and feels like the comics. This is the biggest thing. Even if you're doing something that's not necessarily the most optimum solution, as long as it feels like the comic book solution to it, then you feel right about it, because it's just Dredd, or it's Slain, or it's Strontium Dog, or what have you. All fits together that way.
I want to explore a little bit, just kind of beyond 2000 AD's page and beyond its adaptations of its game. Do you think 2000 AD, having been part of this kind of punky countercultural movement through the 70s and 80s, do you think it had an effect on games beyond the direct adaptations? Do you think, Ian, you said you were a fan, and do you think there was inspiration there for other kind of games that people might not necessarily notice? Yeah,
definitely. I mean, you can't pinpoint it to anything in particular, but you're certainly influenced by what you see and read and absorb. Therefore, that goes into your brain and might come out in a different format, different shape, and distilled into something else. But it definitely plays a big influence. The way D&D played an influence on Final Fantasy, the way I'm sure Lord of the Rings had an influence on Gary Gygax. And you can't pinpoint anything precisely, but there's definitely an influence from all culture and subculture that you absorb along your life's journey. So for me, it was comics and science fiction books, and that's led to me wanting to do science fiction fantasy games.
Mm-hmm. When you guys moved into the more sci-fi end of stuff, 40K, was there any like direct influences, or was it again just that it was kind of like it felt like it was in the air, if you know what I mean?
I don't know. I can speak to this because I started just after Rogue Trader came out for Warhammer 40,000, and I did the adaptation to its second edition, where it kind of became a box game rather than a series of books. And there was a lot of 2000 AD influence in there, I must admit. For everyone around the studio, we all read it. And we all had it as a common touchstone. And you'd see this when a movie came out, where we'd all go and see the movie, whether it be Starship Troopers or what have you. And then we'd all be able to reference the same points and say, like that. And that was very much the case with 2000 AD. It was very much in the DNA for all the guys working at the studio, along with stuff like Michael Moorcock books as well. That was another good touchstone, which, clearly, especially when you look at earlier Warhammer, you can see so much of the influence of Michael Moorcock coming through in that as well. But other fantasy authors as well, and other sci-fi authors as well. And it is grist to the mill, really. It all becomes this vast melange of common tropes, common touchstones in terms of ideas. But for me, certainly working on 40K, I always had 2000 AD strips in the back of my head, whether it was Judge Dredd or Rogue Trooper or Strontium Dog or VCs or what have you, because that's what I'd grown up with. ABC Warriors was another huge one. Nemesis the Warlock was another huge one, because I'd literally grew up, in the playground at school reading 2000 AD. So the stuff like the Knights Marshals, Great Satellite coming down and so forth was seared into my memory at that point. And I'd sit there counting the number of backgliders in a block war and stuff like that, absolutely fascinated by it all. So naturally, when you get to do something yourself creative, all that comes flowing out of it. Oh, this was cool. I'll try and use this in some way.
I mean, it's impossible to have a totally original idea that's never been done before. I mean, just about everything has been done before in creative terms. It's just a metamorphosis of loads of people's previous stuff. Yeah. Like the dog barking for no reason.
Keeping you safe from the dreadful birds or whatever is out there.
I'm just always fascinated by the kind of extent to which this kind of stuff is secular, in the sense that, like, D&D, for example, kind of archetypes that are heavily influenced by, say, Jack Vance or Tolkien or whoever, in turn then become the thing that influences, the next Jack Vance type or Tolkien type, and the extent to which there's the kind of cross-pollination of from one medium into the other and then back again is always really fascinating to me. in the sense that like the ways in which something like, for the sake of the argument, like 2000 AD might have influenced Games Workshop, and then Games Workshop might in turn have influenced 2000 AD in the way in which those kind of cultural touchstones pull the tide of a culture in a particular direction. So it's not that there's necessarily any lifting of anything so much as a generation of excitement about particular scopes or ideas or tones or whatever that just pulls everything along with it. It's always really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think people get excited by stuff and want to do something similar, don't they? I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. We shouldn't. It's not ripping anybody off. It's
not at all. No, the opposite, I think.
Playing influence, but I mean, you talked about Jack Vance. Gary Gygax said "The Dying Earth" was a big influence on him for D&D, and and Final Fantasy game books. I'm told all the time that they influenced a lot of people's careers and paths, and want to become writers, artists, etc., which is great. I mean, that's how the world works, isn't it? We're probably all influenced by Greek culture from millennia ago, ultimately.
One of the things that always strikes me, I don't play 40k, but several of my friends do, and it's always so noticeable to me. I look at their figures, I look at the game book, and I go, I can see the influence. We've talked about Moorcock, we've talked about medieval history. Some of these figures are, to my untrained eye, are basically Kevin O'Neill's Terminators from Nemesis the Warlock, made flesh. You can kind of see that direct line. Not that anybody's being ripped off here, but that clearly there is that confluence of ideas and inspiration. So, that kind of Gothic, quasi-religious, imagery. It's right there, and it's amazing to see that it's one of the influences on a game that's gone global. One of the little details I loved when I was looking at research for this was that Andy, you mentioned that the original rule book for 40k was called Rogue Trader, because it was subtitled Warhammer 40k to differentiate itself from the Rogue Trooper game that was at the same time. Was that something that was, you kind of consciously went, oh right, yes, actually we need to make sure that
that was slightly before my time. I say Rogue Trader had already been published in, I think it was 88 that it came out, and Rogue Trooper I think was out just before that. So because Rogue Trader was always intended more as a role-playing sort of a game. It was more like Warhammer Fantasy in space, I think, was the conceptualization behind it. But that's not really what people used it for. It was more of a Warhammer in space, as it turned out. So yeah, the name being Rogue Trader, I think that was basically used because it had been used in an advert in some Citadel fanzine at some point, and that was like, oh, we better stick with it. But I do know that there was a bit of cross messaging. But at that point, as Ian touched on, Games Workshop was starting to sort of pull away from using 2000 AD based IPs and moving into generating its own. So I don't know, when was the Rogue Trooper board game?
They were both 87, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely sort of like, oh crap, we've got 2 Rogue something games coming out this year. We better stick a tagline on the other one to make sure that they don't get confused. So is that one on the cards as well? Rogue Trooper, I should say. You can't possibly say, but we'll.
We'll see how it goes. I mean, one of the things is like I love those games, right? But everything has an opportunity cost, and I don't want to just be looking backwards all the time as well. Like I love those titles and I'm really excited about bringing them back, but I don't want to do them all at once. I want to start looking at what the future of so I'm not like running the board game division of 2000 AD, right? I'm running a board game company owned by the same owners as 2000 AD. And I would be ludicrous not to try and use some of the kind of IP I have access to, because it's fascinating and it's deep and it's it gets people excited. Mm-hmm. But I think what I'm trying to be consciously, right, whether or not explicitly, is like a board game company with the spirit of 2080 and everything we put out, in the sense of like just taking it up and being able to get into it straight away and being kind of fascinated by it and excited by it, and giving people the sense that we've all been talking about, right? That when you pick something up and it's like, you know, you're talking about the background characters in the panel of Blockmania, and being like fascinated and excited enough by the experience you were having that it was kind of formative to you, and that it was not that it needed to be counterculture, because at a certain point I think both Games Workshop and 2080 were popular enough that I don't think they can count as counter anymore.
No, Punk will never die. You can't say that.
Okay,
yeah, maybe you can.
Of buzz, do you know what I mean? The sense of like trying to remove the barriers to access that a lot of tabletop games have, and give them that same kind of like sharpness, I suppose, that 2080 has, but not the cynicism that could sometimes be misinterpreted as, if you know what I mean. Like I've always, even when 2080 was at its darkest, I never felt like any of it was hopeless, you know.
No.
So that seems like an odd thing to be comparing as regards a tabletop game. But be it in an RPG or in a board game or whatever else, I want people to be having like engaging with narratives and worlds in a way that they find really approachable, in a way that they find really exciting, and even if it's, as we say, a bit sharp, in a way that they find kind of uplifting to an extent as well.
I think it's a narrow path that you have to walk to a certain extent between having a challenge, having threat, grimness, whatever it is, and your ability to counter that as a player is always something you've got to balance carefully, because, as you say, a lot of playing games is all about a power trip at the end of the day. I am powerful, I am mighty, I can do something about this. That becomes meaningless if the threat isn't strong enough. In that case, you're just a bully, you know. If you're beating up all the rabbits and that's your special ability, then that doesn't make you strong and powerful. You have to make them the bad guys. But at the same time, you can't make the bad guys so overwhelming and so crushing and so unstoppable that they can't be stopped unless you break the verisimilitude of your IP. So it can be a bit of a fine line. You see movies run up against it all the time because they're sort of like tend to be one and done. So they tend to be like, this is the biggest threat ever. This is the most badass person ever. And it can be hard to do when you're telling something longer, like a game or a role-playing game or a series of comic strips. I think you've got a little bit more elbow room to examine that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it's a case of exactly as you say, not to necessarily feel like create power fantasies that are around having power over other people, but necessarily that, like, I think a lot of 2080, regardless of be it Nemesis, be it Rogue, be it Dredd, be it Slain, is about power fantasies of resistance to some extent. And in Dredd specifically, it's like it's almost the inversion of that in some ways. Yes. But it's about like going up against something bigger than yourself, celebrating the act of going up against it, even if you're not capable of taking it down. And that in and of itself is something worth celebrating, I think is something that is, if not uniquely 2080, then kind of definitively 2080 to my mind. And that's the kind of thing that's the kind of game experience that I want to create. That's the thing that I want to take from it. Like I want to have Satanas in a game. I want to have, or whatever kind of mad Kevin O'Neill art I can get. But more than that, I want to have the spirit of that energy and that drive that people really responded to.
Yeah, absolutely. To inspire. It's always the desire to inspire people through your game.
What about production values? How key are they? I think today's baseball games, everyone gets excited about the bits, don't they?
Yeah.
And since Meeples became a thing, everyone wants loads of great production bits, and you see games going on Kickstarter for £100 plus just because people want glorious components. So not sure if a Judge Dredd board game is coming out anytime this year, but if it were, what kind of production value would it have, and what kind of components would the Dredd pieces in your mind, just theoretical, of course, be in kind of abstract pawns, or would there be real Judge Dredd miniatures and the like?
I think you go one direction or the other in some ways. Like, I think abstract pawns are right for a particular type of game, but I think like something like Warlord's Line at the moment, I have a handful here actually. I don't know because I've got the camera set I've got right. You're not going to be able to tell, but the level of detail they've got in their minis is absolutely beautiful. I've got the Wally Squad judges here. They just permanently live on my desk because I love them. I think you put the bling in the areas where it most.
Beautiful. Wonderful.
That's a workshop.
Yeah.
Collector's item.
Lovely.
I love how also it was perfectly framed by that shaft of light that's been chasing.
Someone's killing me.
To my mind, you put the bling in the areas where it most adds to the experience. So, like your Judge Dredd game, Ian, for example, I think the particular target for that is, as you were saying, something kind of accessible, something really, really welcoming and playable. And one of the things we want to do is have like alternative player characters. But one of the original core hooks of that was that the art captured so many people's imaginations between the cards and, as you say, Ian Gibson on the board and Brian on the box. So what I'm explicitly doing by choice with that is I'm going to do standees, but I'm going to have standees from some of the classic artists included in the game to really underline that connection to the kind of the world of those characters as defined by those artists, because that to me seems like a core part of what that game is about and what the experience of playing that game is about. Whereas for something like Warlord's Dredd game, where it's very much about kind of a larger battle and a large group of characters, and like spending a lot of time in a particular game and spending a lot of detail and like putting the time into painting those miniatures and whatever, that's the place where the chrome being the plastics and where people can add their own levels of detail on top of it really gets the benefit of those types of kind of figures. So it's not necessarily just about flat production values, because it's going to be made really nicely. Yeah. The point is more about the fitting the manufacturing processes to the tone of the game as much as the mechanics of the IP,
I just remember when we first launched Judge Dredd, we had pawns in it rather than Judge Dredd characters, miniatures. And when we did a subsequent editions, we did introduce plastic Judge Dredd characters, and there's a huge noise around that because people started painting them and saying, "Oh, these are now collectible." But if it's just abstract, it's not meaningless, but it doesn't have that wow factor.
Yeah, I think when you're dealing with an IP with a set image, it's incumbent on you to use that wherever you can. And yeah, classic case in point, people respond an awful lot better to little plastic Judge miniatures than pawns in a game about Judge Dredd. Of course they do. Not such an easy thing when you're starting out with a game, and you may not have the option to tool components like that. But certainly for a tabletop miniatures game, it's all about the miniatures at the end of the day. The rules are always a vehicle for actually making the miniatures available, and they are very much collectible items as far as people are concerned. They want to know when such and such characters are coming out and things like that.
But one thing I wanted to touch on, particularly considering how for certainly some of my friends, things like the Judge Dredd game were their gateway to becoming gamers, to the bigger, more complex games. I want to talk about accessibility and being able, how you kind of get people as quickly as possible into this sandbox, because, based on what you were all saying earlier, it's about sparking the imagination and, feeling like you are being immersed in this world. How do you do that without overcomplicating things? How do you keep it accessible? How do you make it the kind of game that somebody plays when they're 13 years old and it sparks a lifelong interest?
13-year-olds are actually a lot easier to get to play a bad game than 30-year-olds. I can tell you that much. Because you've got no discernment when you're young. You just play what's put in front of you. I played dreadful games when I was 13 years old. Awful. Just appalling. Wouldn't be publishable today. But that was all there was. So all my career as a games designer has been trying to make games better than those because of exactly what you're talking about, the inaccessibility of them. Games from that era tend to be very long, 3 hours, 6 hours minimum, stuff like that. No one plays that kind of game anymore. When it comes to accessibility, you got to be able to explain it in 5 to 10, play it within an hour and a half at most. With the opportunity, with expandability, hopefully, that if people do want to have an all-day game, get the pizza in and all the rest of it, that you can do that. That touches again on what you were saying earlier, Duncan, about Judge Dredd and maybe doing some expansion maps. We've seen this sort of thing a lot from Fantasy Flight Games with Arkham Horror and stuff like that, where you've got the core game and then you've got a whole lot of extra boards that you can add into it. If you want to have a giant game, you can, or if you just want to play on one of those boards, you can. As the games industry has got bigger and more diverse, and God help us, digital publishing has made all this sort of thing possible, that's more viable. Back in the day when it was a few mimeograph sheets and, some basic pawns, you couldn't do that kind of thing. So you got what you got, which was generally the most mad, dedicated designers out there producing a simulator of some description.
The thing about games is that, particularly with something like Judge Dredd, which is quite a light game, is that you have to be able to... No one likes reading rules. The reason why Monopoly is so successful is because no one's ever read the rule in their lives. It's been passed down from mother and father to their children and down the line. So that's why it survived the test of time. Whatever game group I'm in, nobody wants to volunteer to read the rules because you kind of start reading them and you gloss over and what was that? And then no one's paying attention when you explain it. So if you've got a game like Judge Dredd board game, which has the potential to go beyond the core market because of its light
accessibility,
it has to be able to be learned very quickly. So you're talking about 1 or 2 pages of rules most, and a game which is probably, in my mind, is easy to get into but hard to master. So that's because that creates a replayability factor. So it's really important. That's the rules are very, very simple to understand.
I meant to ask you actually, in Apocalypse, that was the one out of those. Judge Dredd and Apocalypse are the two that I played out of those early Games Workshop games. Where did that come from? Because that's also beautifully simple as a game.
It's great. It's just a fantastic game. It was invented by Mike Hayes, who was a lecturer at Sheffield University, and it was previously self-published by him under the name The Warlord on this big silk screen board. And as you say, the Apocalypse is just like 1/4 of the actual original game. And that's what Risk should have been in my mind. Risk is picking up a great handful of dice and dropping them and see what happens. And whereas this is that deduction thing about combat, and area expansion is really good. And then the extra bit of the nukes. The nukes and the
nukes as well. Oof, yeah. Amazing game.
Great game. The only problem with it is very difficult to finish because as soon as you move over to one side and then you're being attacked on the other side, then you come back and then the other person builds up there. It's got they should be done on a time basis and then count up the number of areas you own. Otherwise it can go on forever. But it's a really great game. It's definitely top 10 for me.
Yeah, the original Warlord that you talked about there, where it was actually 4 boards, so it was the whole world. Back when I was a nipper And I used to go down to the Asgard War Games Club. We used to play that with
I've
6
got
or
one
8
on my
players.
shelf. I've got one.
Oh man, so many hours of, and what you say basically, like tides going around the world one way or another.
Yeah.
And by the time somebody had like exhausted all their forces, somebody else has built up behind them and takes it all off them. And oh man, the back and forth, just endless. Terrific games, really.
We are running out of time. So I just wanted to have a quick plenary and just touch on, we've talked about the past, we've talked about the fantastic games from the 1980s, and we've talked about the future as well. And I just wanted to get your final thoughts on, we're celebrating 45 years of 2000 AD. Is the influence of 2000 AD as strong in games as it once was? Is there an opportunity for a renaissance that kind of puts it back there as part of gaming culture? Ian, what are your thoughts?
I like to think it is. I mean, there are so many other board games around now. I mean, the whole board games industry has boomed. I think at Essen last year, there was something like 1,800 new games released, which is extraordinary. So there's an awful lot of competition out there. So games have to be good and have the potential to scale. I mean, obviously the big sellers, Ticket to Ride, Carcassonne, Catan, they're very accessible games. And they built up an enormous following and sold millions of copies, literally, because of that accessibility and player engagement and fun. But getting back to your question, there's so much rich content in 2000 AD. I'm absolutely convinced that it's still having a very big influence on game design in principle, albeit more of a niche influence because the board games market is so rich and varied these days on a global scale. But those who are messing around designing science fiction and fantasy games, I'm sure they're still being influenced by 2000 AD.
I think so, even if they're not conscious that they are, actually, because of what you said. Because now we've got to a whole generation of people making movies, making games, making comics of their own, writing books, who've all been influenced by, even if not 2000 AD directly, by things like Games Workshop, who were influenced by 2000 AD and still influence 2000 AD. So the great swirl of it continues, I do believe, as an inspirational force. And there are some solid touchstones now in 2000 AD that have been around for 45 years. We're talking about Judge Dredd. It's had 2 movies made out of it. And when you look at things like the MCU, it's tapping into that similar thing of like, there's actually such a body of work there now that of course they can produce 24 movies or whatever the hell it is over a short period of time, because they have that already like on the shelf in comic book form. 2000 AD's got the same thing going on for it in a far more sort of scattershot way, but that's part of the glory of it. There's so many different ideas of exploration, of future war, of self-examination, of body horror, all the rest of it that you can find through the pages of 2000 AD over the years. I still have a subscription to this day because I consider it to be an essential ingredient, really, to see what's going on, what different artists around the world want to draw pictures of, what different writers want to write about. I think it's remarkable we still have an organ around to do that, to share those ideas on a weekly basis, man, on a weekly basis. That strips away so much pretension. I've worked in publishing where we had to publish a monthly magazine. I know what that's like. You have to go with the best you've got without too many prejudgments or like, I don't know, maybe we could polish this up another 3% and all the rest of it. You don't. You go with things out. You put ideas out there raw, and that's very Darwinian in its own way. And this is why we know Judge Dredd is a strong IP, because it's survived for 45 years in a weekly magazine. I challenge you to come up with many other examples like that. Spider-Man is the sort of stuff you're looking at. Superman, Batman. So we're right in there.
So yes, unfortunately, we are completely out of time. So I want to thank our amazing guests. Thank you so much. That was absolutely as a complete newbie to games, that was absolutely fascinating. So thank you to Andy, Duncan, and to Ian for chatting away. Appreciate it, guys. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thanks.
Good talk, guys.
Thanks a lot for having us.
Great. Take care now.
Bye-bye.
Gotta go. Bye.